So we are going to switch to all three of our panelists and myself. And we're going to go through some questions. So let's start with Dr. Powers. There was a quick question when you were explaining, I believe it was regards to the marshes and the oysters. What was the shoreline response is, what the dispersant, was it a dispersant treatment? Was it a blasting water? And then later on, did you look at the consecutive days at less than 5% or less than 10 PSU?
So the response actions, there wasn't dispersant release, so we don't think it was complicated by dispersant release. The shoreline activities involved landing teams on the marsh, walking on the marsh, actually swabbing marsh grass and trying to get up the oil, hosing, high pressure washing, just a variety of collection methods is kind of encapsulated in that figure. We did look to see how our results in the near shore would be, how they were affected by the release of fresh water. And we didn't see any difference between areas that were influenced by the freshwater diversion and areas that were not influenced by the freshwater diversions. And that's probably because that nearshore band of oyster is used to experiencing pretty low salinities because of rainfall.
Okay. Our next question is for Dr. Jennifer Pollock. What is the range of CO2 absorption of our oysters? What percentage off for oysters were damaged by oil spills? And what is the criteria for selecting a reef to restore? So you get a three-part question.
I think part 2 must be for Sean, but I'll do my best on part 1 and part 3. So in terms of carbon capture and storage by oysters, again, these are values from the literature, from those 10 papers that exist, and they range from anything from capture of something around 20,000 grams of carbon per square meter per year to emissions of something like 700 grams of carbon per square meter per year. So it's a really wide range, which is why there's a lot of interest in trying to really narrow this down and understand a little bit more what characteristics can facilitate carbon sequestration by oysters. And then I think the third question about what criteria would constitute a good place to restore a reef. Typically what we've done is we've used these habitat suitability indices. So we've looked at what characteristics of habitat, so that might be water quality, temperature, existence of historic reef, the substrate being able to support reef, or the bay bottom being able to support, thousands of pounds of reef substrate being placed on the bottom. So essentially you're looking at conditions that are going to support the long-term growth and suitability of oysters. Also, if you're in an area that's only substrate limited, or you'd want to figure out why the reef isn't there in the first place. So if it's because there are no substrates for the oysters to attach to, you can solve that problem. If it's because there are no source populations of oysters, that's going to require a little bit more work. But it could be something like, there's an interruption to the watershed. Maybe there's a change in the delivery of fresh water to the system, for example. So you'd want to look at the site, but you'd also want to look at the broader set of circumstances that are influencing your system.
Gotcha. Great. We'll flip over to Dr. Powers again. Would it be tricky to harvest nearshore intertidal oysters if they provide so much shoreline protection? Couldn't we be promoting erosion by harvesting those intertidal oysters?
Yes, and you would be by harvesting those oysters. Those oysters, like I said in the talk, are generally not harvested because it's so shallow, it's hard for a boat to get into the system. They do serve the basis for the fishery in South Carolina and North Carolina. but they're generally not attractive. They're elongated oysters because they grow rapidly in clusters, and they don't form that big cup that people traditionally want to see in the raw trade. In South Carolina, the low county cookouts generally steam those. And it's quite a challenge to eat oysters steamed in a big hummock that they come across. So there's not much pressure on them. And like I said, there is kind of a protection because of their inaccessibility.
If I could add to Sean's comments and just say that in Texas, actually, Texas Parks and Wildlife back in 2017 now has prevented the harvest of those intertidal oysters because there were some situations where the subtidal areas of the bay were closed, either to too many undersized oysters, for example, that the fishing pressure moved into these intertidal areas in which it really had never been concentrated in the past. And there was such loss of these important habitats, like Sean is saying, that we are just starting to understand are likely quite different for a number of reasons than those subtidal reefs. So at least in our state, there has been a move to protect those from commercial harvest.
On the flip side, some states are very hesitant to approve restoration activities in those because of the idea of an attractive nuisance, that you're actually encouraging people to harvest from closed waters because of that. So what Jenny said is wonderful that Texas has protected it, but it's an issue for restoration. This idea of attractive nuisance.
That's interesting. I have, I think, 2 restoration questions for Jenny. Texas had extensive mining of beds in the past. Have any of those areas been restored?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So Texas has a really unique history in the fact that at the turn of the last century and in the early 1900s, that there was a thriving industry in almost every bay system where the reefs were harvested for what they call mud shell. So it wasn't harvested just for the edible tissue of the oyster, but it was actually harvested for that shell substrate. And you can find maps that show that all of the coastal roads in Texas essentially had a bed of oyster shells, just because there's not really a location to get gravel or any other sort of rock substrate here. Those modifications to the bay systems were likely quite severe. And I don't know the exact answer to that question, but my feeling would be that some of those areas that have had those shells removed probably have had them removed to a depth that the surface substrate may not be able to, or the surface sediment may not be able to support restoration, although some may still be able to. So it would be, I don't know how, I haven't seen maps that have shown exactly the areas that were harvested and how much was harvested from each location within the bay, and that's likely because that was all done by private companies at the time.
And following along with you're talking about your sustainable areas or that would work, has the oyster suitability work done in Texas been done in other areas of the Gulf Coast? How sort of exportable is the information or methodology for somewhere else in the Gulf?
Yes, so folks have done this habitat suitability work across the Gulf in the different states, and typically you're limited by the types of data that you have available to you. So typically in the different states, the resource management agencies may be collecting information, fisheries independent monitoring data, for example, in different ways. And so what we have done definitely can provide a framework or a guide of these are things that we found to be useful. But certainly there may be more types of data that are available in different states that could be used to enhance this effort, or you may have to limit some of these data depending on what's available. I will give an example and just say that in Texas, a colleague of mine who's I know is going to be speaking in one of your seminars, Dr. Joe Fox, is using this restoration suitability index now to build upon to create a mapping effort for aquaculture siting in Texas. So that's going to incorporate different types of things like access issues and things that we weren't really necessarily considering in terms of long-term reef sustainability.
That's very interesting. Okay, I've got one last question, and I'll kind of let everybody give a point to it or give their thoughts for it. For restoration, are there ever issues of lack of support from a community, or is there generally pretty strong buy-in and interest in and support for those efforts?
I'll start. We haven't really run up against any friction from coastal communities. Typically, they are in support of it because they recognize the benefits like recreational fishing support, shoreline protection. They like that a lot of them get their school kids involved. So there's some environmental education aspects that roll into it as well. So we have generally been supported by our community, but I'll let Sarah and Sean add in.
So I would agree with that. Generally, it's very supportive. We do have, and it's important in restoration planning, some user conflict in Alabama and Mississippi, and that is concerns by the shrimp trawlers when you're creating an oyster reef that removes trawlable bottom from them. So that is a user conflict. Most of our conflicts, though, come with the public health services, who are very concerned about guaranteeing oysters be created in areas suitable for harvest. And as we talked about a little bit earlier, that's not always where we want to restore oysters. So that's probably the biggest issues that we have is the public health service concerns, and they're legitimate concerns. And then the shrimpers and trying to resolve some of those user conflicts.
Great. That is all the questions we've received. So I think we're going to wrap up. Thanks for everyone who was able to stay a little bit longer and listen to our question and answers. And thank you very much to all of our panelists. We really appreciate your time and your interest and your ability to speak today. So thank you everyone for joining us. As Jenny said, we're going to have some more oyster seminars coming up. And as a Sea Grant team, we have a number of other seminars that will be coming up this summer. So please keep an eye out, and we look forward to for you guys to join us. So thank you again, everyone, and have a great day.